Welcome to Zelda's Peaches and Biscuits podcast. I'm Elena Doughton, the executive director of the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum.
And I'm Maura Martello. I'm a Zelda researcher, a huge fan of Zelda, and I am a docent here at Fitzgerald Museum. Welcome.
And so today, this is our first episode, and we're going to call it On This Day. We are going to begin with a newspaper article from March 26, 1911. This is the first significant appearance of Zelda in any media or print media, but it's also March 26, 1920 is the 100th anniversary of the publication of This Side of Paradise. So what we have decided to do in the first stages of this podcast is to begin on the 26th of March when Zelda is 11 years old and try to recreate her life, her time here in Montgomery, her meeting Scott, up until March 26th of 1920, because the publication of This Side of Paradise changes their lives entirely.
Absolutely. They will go on to fame and fortune from that, from the publication of that book.
So we thought this would be a great window to look at first Zelda, her life, her family, what was Montgomery like, and try to build the largest possible picture of her life here, what she was like, her friends were like, before she meets Scott Fitzgerald. And then we will talk about their lives together here in Montgomery, what Montgomery was like when he was stationed here, and their early, I guess, courtship, we'll say. So today we want to start by first going over the interview of Zelda. It was called Children of the Alabama Judiciary, and it was written by Marie Bankhead Owen. And then we're going to look at the various newspaper stories, ads, what innovations were present in 1911. What was not only life in America like, but what was life specifically like in Montgomery, and what were Montgomeryans talking about? And the best indication we have is from that newspaper.
Yeah, we're talking about the Montgomery Advertiser,
Yes.
which at that time was an independent newspaper. Today, of course, it's owned by Gannett, is it
I
not?
think so.
Yeah. It doesn't have quite the local color that it had.
It once did.
Yeah.
So first, let's start with Marie Bankhead Owen. She was the wife of Thomas Owen. She was a huge influence on Montgomery. Historically, a very complex figure. She is the aunt of Tallulah Bankhead. She is the sister of John Bankhead, who was a state senator. She and her husband Thomas founded the Alabama State Archives. She's the first woman to hold a department level appointment in Montgomery or in Alabama. She goes on to form the original Women or Writers Association. I'm not sure the name. Later, she was head of the Women's Pen League, and just a major cultural influence here. Again, somewhat, I think, in history, and we are hopefully going to have someone come in and talk about her and kind of flesh that out. But for today, she had various columns for the Montgomery Advertiser, and then she has this special edition called Children of the Alabama Judiciary, where she interviews the various judges' children. And of course, Zelda's father was Judge A.D. Sayre, and who was a state Supreme Court judge here. She also interviews Sarah Mayfield. We will be using Sarah Mayfield's book,
Exiles in
yes,
Paradise.
Yeah. So
Yes.
if you can find a copy, because we're gonna rely heavily on it for clues into both their childhood. So let's get into the article now. Do you want to? Well, also I think let's talk about the first impression as you see the photos. And we see a very, I think, pensive young Zelda in 1911. Do you want to describe what she looks like?
She fascinates me as a child. In the photograph, she's wearing an extremely frilly frock. I would say it was a pin. She has a pinafore over the dress, I think, and she has what was very popular at that time, almost like a fascinator. Would you call it? It's a headpiece.
No.
It's a bow.
It's a huge
gigantic.
Southern bow.
Okay.
You're not from the South.
No, I'm not.
I think all Southerners listening, you know this photo because children still today have their portrait made this way. It's the white. Hers isn't smocked, but it's the white dress and the huge bow on the forehead. I mean, the forehead on her head. She has very short bobbed hair. And this is still the standard for portraiture today. The dress today is normally a smocked white gown, but they'll all have that huge bow. But her expression is what I think fascinates us both.
Yes. The force of character in Zelda's face at the age of 11 is so evident. It's so clear. It comes right through who this person is. You get it. That's unusual in children. And if you look at the photographs of the other children who are included in this article, they all look very happy in their pinafores and their big white bows. She looks like she's itching to get out of it and get back into her tomboy clothes and go play in the mud or, do what she usually did, which was, maybe steal a carriage, and whip the horses into a frenzy. So that is what hits me when I look at this photograph. We have a force to be reckoned with.
I also think it's very telling, when you have the photo of the kid and it's either going to be sent to the family in this case, portraiture at this time is not inexpensive. It's still not inexpensive, but at this time, I think it was probably Tressler, was a local photographer.
Did many of Zelda's portraits.
And so to have your portrait done that you're moving away from painted portraits, but it's not an inexpensive thing, and it's not an insignificant thing that all of these children have had their photo taken, because they're clearly studio photos. Yeah. So you want as a parent, you have to cajole the child to smile. And I think it's an indication of her parents as well that either her force of will was such that she was not forced to have the happy standard photo, or they were fine that she didn't.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Go ahead.
There are children who are smiling here. Some of them look kind of grim. But there's a conventional look in all the other photographs that doesn't exist in. Another thing I always pick up on Zelda, she has very brooding eyes. Yes. They're very dark, at least in photographs. I think they were blue in reality or gray. But there's a brooding intelligence. That's the only way I can describe it that I just find remarkable. And it's why we have a podcast. I want to get to the bottom of who this woman was.
This photo also reminds me, you see the same look when she's older, when they're on, and we will try to put these on show notes and on Instagram, so you will be able to see these. That it's a very similar photo when they're, I think, in Rome. There's her, and you see there's a temple in the background. She's getting in the car. She has a beret on, and it's just a very similar look that
you see it in a few photos. Yeah. I think you see it in one of the photographs, the more serious photograph for the dust jacket. Mm-hmm. One, she's smiling and is happy, and the other, I would describe it as brooding. Something, I don't know, Elena, maybe you have a different take on.
No, I just think you just have this very strong personality that is not bowing to convention. Right. At her very first appearance that we have in media. And then when you contrast it with the other children, she really does stand out from just this kind of photo array there.
She really does. I mean,
there's nine images. Some are, siblings together, but she just stands in very stark contrast.
Yeah.
So turning to the article, Marie Bankhead Owen explains that as a reporter that essentially you don't, well, I'll read this. It says, one of the rules given to a cub reporter by the city editor is when you're interviewing a man, don't, if possible, make your notes in his presence, i.e., I think that's so that they don't know they're being interviewed. You know,
Yeah.
today it was like secretly turn on your recorder, I think would be
right.
would be the analogy today. And so she says, that is the way Ms. Zelda Sayre was interviewed for this story. She had been running with her little playmates and was entirely out of breath. It was an easy matter to catch her, therefore, being a friendly and direct little girl in her manner of speech and thought, and she was found to be a fine subject, although unconscious of the purpose of the questions fired at her.
And that word direct immediately leaps out at me because
Yeah.
we know that she was an extremely direct person. You see that over and over again in interviews with friends and family.
Yeah.
She was very straightforward.
And I also think my issue with a lot of the biographies is that they paint her as a Southern belle, and I just don't think that's in any way an accurate description. And hopefully we can help unravel that. That
Try to
she,
debunk it even.
yeah, is that you can see the stereotype of a Southern belle she would have learned even at this young age to be very demure. I mean,
to dissemble.
yes, and to kind of and this is also 1911. Children are seen, not heard. I mean, when I was a child in the 80s, we still went to charm school in second grade. All the little girls in my class went to this weekend charm school, and you learned how to sit. I still have it. It's this book called White Gloves and Party Manners, and you learn how to set the table, say yes, ma'am, no. I mean, this is how, and this is 1911. So the fact that she's direct and that she hasn't, that I think I don't know if it's her mother and father. I don't think her parents were as hands-off as it seems. We'll get more about her mother, but her mother was the wild lily of the Cumberland. Mm-hmm. That I don't think that, and that's another thing with a biography, I don't think Zelda was rebellious within her family as they paint. Mm-hmm. I don't think
there
her
was a bohemian aspect in her.
I think her family very much was. Yeah. And we heard last night, it was interesting, we heard from Sam Lanahan a story that I'd never heard about Judge Sayre, and that how Judge Sayre, the college that he was at, they had Roanoke, they had gotten a new president or headmaster, the previous one had passed. The new one came in and it seemed either unfairly or was strict, authoritarian, and that her father essentially as a young man led a protest which eventually had him removed and a more equitable or fair president replaced. So that you had this sense of, I don't know how you would characterize it, so that he wasn't, even though he's a judge and everyone said, judges can be very by the book. Like my thoughts on him is he may have been like a very strict constructionist, very down because he never had, he's well known that he never had a ruling overturned. So in a way you think, well, maybe he played it safe, he was reticent, but I don't think you get that impression from her. But more importantly, as we'll find out, her sisters were very independent women as well.
And Mrs. Sayre was as well.
So I think you're seeing all of that here, and the fact that she was direct, spoke her mind freely. But I also think she's speaking her mind to a very powerful woman. Marie Bankhead Owen was really powerful, and I think had a lifelong influence on Zelda. We know kind of to the end that when Zelda, after Scott's death, Zelda lives here. Zelda belongs to the Penn Women's League with Marie Bankhead Owen. We know from newspaper clippings that they're often at events together. So I think Marie Bankhead Owen is one of the many very strong, very independent women that Zelda may have modeled herself after.
Yeah, she was surrounded by these strong women growing up, and obviously that had a great influence on her life later on, and maybe caused some ripples in her marriage later on. Who knows?
Because she, and I think this is the contention that you and I will probably make over and over. She was not a Southern belle.
Right.
She was not this demure young woman who was
Clinging
pretty,
vine.
who was only expected to be pretty and marry well. Yeah, it just wasn't for this family. And if you look at her friends, Tallulah Bankhead, no. Sarah Mayfield divorced her husband. You think Sarah Hart Mencken married one of the most stalwart bachelors, H.L. Mencken.
Broke him down.
Yeah, so you just think even her contemporaries broke the mold on the Southern Belle. So the next, well, I guess we will read some of this. It says, of course, she may resort to a repudiation of the foregoing interview, in which case these columns are open to her gifted pen. It is taken for granted that her pen is gifted because her mother is such a clever writer. Some time ago, when Montgomery authors were featured in a local story, the name of this brilliant woman, a native of Kentucky, but for many years a loyal Alabamian, ranked high on the list. And then she goes on to talk about Zelda's mother's work as an author.
One of her short stories was "The Beast That Bore Me," was undoubtedly the forerunner inspiration of a celebrated novel. Not that Marie Bankhead Owens goes into what that celebrated novel was, but obviously she felt that Mrs. Sayre, Minnie Machen Sayre herself, was an influential writer who obviously influenced other fine writers.
We'll get more into Zelda's mother, but she was published nationally, short stories, I think Southern's Fetters. We will get into this. Her mother was also had a very strong voice and also published nationally on vocal training. So she's writing poems, short stories. We have not been able to find the novel, but she also is publishing in technical vocal magazines. So, I mean, Zelda's mother's, yes.
So she's being interviewed here. She's a little girl. She's 11 years old. She's caught at play, and here she is She talks about the American Indian, or the Native American, as we call them today. She's talking about music. She's talking about art. She's talking about her favorite literature. Quite remarkable for a little. I don't think at 11 I was ready to talk about these subjects.
No, and the other thing about this that really stands out to me is that it's all there. In 1911, well, the first thing she's asked, Marie Bankhead Owen asked her, "What do you like best of everything?" And she says, "To play." Yeah. Which you would expect from 11-year-old, but it also, you think about, I mean, she is the first flapper, and that sense of play, I think, goes through, her entire life. Yeah. And then it says, well, what games do you prefer? And she says, robber, Indian came promptly. I like them best of all because running is such great fun. And it says, do you like storybooks, was the next serious question. She goes, I dearly love them. Reading is my favorite study at school because there are such beautiful tales and books. And she says, and your favorite story, I find this funny, is The Water Babies, which is, if you don't know, we can maybe go over it. It's a very famous story of the time. Do you know The Water Babies?
I don't know The Water Babies. I've certainly heard the title. Is it a British?
Yeah, I heard it when I was living in Australia.
It's very popular among
that generation.
Yeah.
And then she says, next to stories, including those in her reading lessons, that she likes geography because it is true, and tell is her typo, and tells of interesting countries and people. And you think about how nomadic she and Scott were, and how well traveled they were. We would call it wanderlust now. I mean, it's right there.
And here's something. Well, we're going to get back to her interest in the American Indian, but what jumped out at me here is, in her opinion, when she was going to be a grown woman, she was going to give picture recitals instead of musical recitals. And the fact is that later on she went out on to have 3 art exhibitions.
Yeah.
So we're already.
So I don't know what a picture recital is. Is this an early movie? Is this, because it says picture recitals instead of musicals. This is 1911.
Well, remember,
We-
the sentence before is
yeah.
talking about drawing and painting.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm assuming that is her term, whether it's a term of the time, picture recitals. I think she's, personally, I think she's referring to an art exhibition.
An art exhibit, yeah. Which she does go on to do. Because it says, when asked about music, she declared that it was all right, but she liked drawing and painting better and was emphatic in her own opinion that when she was a grown woman, she was going to give picture recitals instead of musicals. So, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
And you think she has her first official exhibition in 34. And, you know, we in Montgomery will, from March 29th until May, they're having the Zelda exhibit. And if you
Yeah.
want to see her images, we can put some up, but we have 12 of her original artworks here at the Fitzgerald home as well.
So come and visit.
Yes, we have a gallery, a permanent gallery dedicated to her work.
So it's all there.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is very interesting, and all of these are things that we know about her from being older. The thing that I found interesting is that the Fitzgeralds never seemed to be very political, and they never really seemed to speak politically. And there are 2 very political things to ask a 9-year-old. And one, where she talks about the Native Americans, she says she thinks Indians are the most entertaining people on earth because they are fearless and such great riders and swimmers. And then she is sorry for them because she thinks they have not always been fairly treated by white men. Mm-hmm. And she says she likes moving pictures that portray Indian life. And I think this is very interesting in Alabama, that she would be cognizant of the mistreatment. And we will kind of get to like, well, how did she, why is this being mentioned? We think we have a clue later in the paper, but that already at 11, she has a sense of racial inequality. Yeah. And you think as we'll also find that between the Civil War and and about this time period, that race is more in flux, that after the Civil War, for example, in the research leading up to this, Montgomery has the first electric streetcars. And they are instituted in the 1880s. And it's not until about then that you begin to see the ordinances making people sit either in the front or the back of the tram, which we'll cover more. So that and the other thing that astounds me about Montgomery, even still, is that the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, built in the 1880s, sits at the foot of the Capitol building. It's not on the periphery of town. It still sits proudly, beautifully at the foot of that Capitol building. And so that I just don't know what happened. Maybe it's a little early in this podcast, but you see it here that there is this sense of it, and that you have this switch. And the second major issue is, she says, rather a fine little interview for a little miss of so few summers. If she were a little mister instead of a little lady, it would be safe prediction to forecast that she would emulate her father, who ranks as one of Alabama's ablest judges, or her great uncle, General John T. Morgan, who adorned the Senate of the United States for so many years. It was not thought to ask Miss Zelda how she stood on the suffrage question. It may be that as time goes by, she will live in a state when women sit in legislative halls. In that case, she begins with unanimous endorsement of the editor of the women's page of this publication on the justifiable grounds of old friendship. So we are still,
how many years away
from suffrage? Well, one from suffrage, 21. Yeah, so 21. We should know. So there is the question of suffrage. There is the question that can a woman serve? And this clue also, there is some question of where Marie Bankhead Owen originally stood on suffrage, but I think she's clearly for it if she thinks a woman's going to sit in the halls of the legislature.
Yeah, and I think she has been compared to somebody like a Phyllis Schlafly later in life. Am I wrong?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I think we're going to have someone come in and I think there's a lot, like in reading her Wikipedia page, if you go, I do not think it's correct. And we're going to kind of unravel that. And that's a part of what I hope we will achieve in this podcast is that, again, we have found enormous amount of new information from the newspaper clippings, archive clippings, papers from the family that have not been discussed or used publicly. We just have a dearth of new information, which I think sheds a lot of new light, where the biographies don't really cover Alabama very well. And hopefully, they just, and I don't think that's because of poor scholarship. I just know that we now have the ability to search archives online. They just didn't have the means that we have. So let's look at the rest of the newspaper from
on March 26, 1911.
So
front page. What's on the front page?
Well, I just want to back up real quick. So we want, by going through the newspaper, we're going to kind of go page to page, starting with the front page, to give you a sense of what the major news stories were. There's some short stories in here. There are some columns, which I think are very interesting, like weekly columns by various people. And we also want to look at the ads because it tells you what new innovations were. And I think a lot of these also, the impact of like domesticity, housework on women is very evident. And the idea...
And the progress.
Because I think that the early 1900s are in many ways parallel to our own. They have this amazing influx of new technologies, which is kind of upending labor, not only domestic labor, but mechanization, factories. Will there be work for people? Is a machine going to take over? That they were dealing with all of like, how do we deal? And I think the newspaper in many ways it was there, but it can be printed faster. You have the morning edition, the evening edition. And I just think
time is speeding up.
Yes, and so I think it will be interesting.
People are having trouble keeping up with it. That's the way we are today, absolutely.
And the other thing is, I'd also like to contrast living in Alabama. I lived overseas for 8 years. I know what everyone in the world thinks of Alabamians, and I just want to be able to show where Alabama was, where it is today. Some of the things we've made amazing progress on. Some things same old. And so hopefully we'll give you a better sense of,
have a sense of humor about it.
Yes. So let's start with the front page. What is the headline for me was very shocking. I'll just back up real quick. So when we realized that this original story or interview of Zelda was on March 26th and that it falls on the same publication date of This Side of Paradise, we decided, hey, what's going on in this newspaper? And when I saw that front page, it took my breath away.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really emotional, so.
And what was it?
Yeah, you go ahead.
She's worried she's going to get emotional.
Yeah, it really hit me.
All right, it was the event called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factor Fire, which obviously happened in New York City and was national news. It's a headline of the Montgomery Advertiser. And for those who don't know, it was a fire in Greenwich Village, or sometimes I refer to as Lower East Side. It depends. I have to look at the address again. Which is a neighborhood in Manhattan. Everybody knows that. And on March 25th, 1911, it was the deadliest industrial disaster in the history of the city, and one of the deadliest in U.S. history. And it's very much akin to New Yorkers, of which I am one. I've only lived in Montgomery for a year. It is very much akin to 9/11. That is what you heard from politicians, historians, and just people who knew the history of New York. It was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factor fire all over again, only large scale.
Yeah. What it is, there was a shirtwaist, if you don't know, it was a women's blouse. 148 women died in this fire. The reason that they died is because they were locked in the building and couldn't escape. So they either died of smoke inhalation, but dozens of women leapt to their deaths. And so when I saw it, I also teach world history, and this is a major moment in American history because it really changes labor practice. Yes. It also helps spurs one of the earliest garment unions for women, but the image of the falling man from 9/11. Yes. So you can search and see the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It led to new labor practices. The women, what they'd done is they had been locked in the building to try to prevent, women
theft,
but also this is where we get the term sweatshop labor. It really, I think, helped improve sweatshop labor. And I'm looking now. You can look at the consequences and the legacy. The
formation of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union came out of this.
Yes.
This terrible tragedy. There have been many tragedies, in New York City, but there's something about fire.
But also, you have women who are leaping, and you look at the images, and they're clearly dressed from that time period. And in terms of labor practice, women's right, this was a major catalyst. But then looking at it as a Zelda scholar, the fact that women were unnecessarily locked in a building.
Here we go again.
And then perish in a fire is just the fact that her first appearance in media that we know about, this interview, there were little blurbs, she's at a party. But the first interview, the first real image that we see of her is buried beneath this horrific fire of
women locked in on an upper floor. And there's a foreshadowing to Zelda's life that I find troubling. Luckily she didn't know any of this, but we're very conscious. I'm very conscious of it. Zelda and fire.
Yeah.
It's a painful subject to talk about as a fan of Zelda, but it has to be acknowledged, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it has to be. But the other thing is that this is 1911. She dies in 48. She dies. I do think the biographies paint. It's the difference between being factual and accurate. It is factual that she died locked in a hospital ward. Some people will use that term asylum. We know, and we'll maybe post the pictures with it too, she was at Highland Hospital, which was far from, like you think today, Batman, Arkham Asylum. It was very comfortable.
Whereas in New York or New Jersey and Creedmoor.
Yeah.
It was the notorious...
and we know that
asylum.
she was there because she could afford to be. Financially, she died with stock. Most people don't realize that. It was very expensive to be where she was. We think that she had early onset dementia from the years of treatment that she had received, which we'll get into in later podcasts. But that she wasn't locked away in this asylum. And the reason that she was in it is because she had been sedated earlier in the day, maybe for electroshock, possibly for insulin shock, but she was in the locked ward because she had been sedated. So she wasn't living locked away.
Now, why were they locking the doors and the windows? Were
they
afraid people?
I don't know. From what I've read, and I don't know if it's entirely known, to this day, that fire, arson was suspected. all but Scotty, all the other women that perished in that fire sued and lost. It was just considered a safety procedure, that they where the sedation where you were held for it was the locked ward. So
Yeah, I was wondering, did they
there's a
think-
lot of mystery surrounding that fire still, and we'll probably get to it eventually. Yeah.
It's a mystery to be another mystery to be unraveled.
Well, I do
possible.
know in Asheville that there has been in the last year or so they're thinking of reinvestigating it. So hopefully,
really?
yeah. So hopefully we will find out. So moving to the next page, which I think is interesting, is most people know, particularly then, certain pages had ads were there before you knew what the headline was going to be. So on page 3, you have overworked girls. Read this, and you have this sense of the working girl. This is a time period where women are really beginning to move into the workforce. And here it's they want you to take this vegetable compound to give you more energy.
Lydia Pinkham's.
Yeah, so you can do more work.
If you read the book True Grit by Charles Portis, a fine writer who just recently passed away, he was an Arkansas writer. He mentions Lydia Pinkham in his book because the protagonist, Maddie Ross, says that most of the women, older women, were devotees of Lydia Pinkham because it was booze.
Yeah. So here you see it, the ad, and again we'll hopefully.
It's a vegetable compound.
It's a vegetable compound, probably spiked, because we're not far from Coca-Cola, which has cocaine in it up until the 20s.
Yes.
So you can have a Coca-Cola and clean the house. So the next is page 5 is a full page of the Horseshoe Bend battle anniversary in 1914. And it says, wide popular interest in this decisive engagement of the Americans and the Creek Indians. And if you don't know Alabama history or from that time period, in 1814 there was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. It's on the Tallapoosa River. The river makes a horseshoe type, a bend in the river. And according to this article, it's the time period, or it's the battle in which basically the Creek resistance was broken. And they're calling to have a kind of, I don't know if celebration's the right word, but they even invite, if you don't know, you then have the Trail of Tears, where the Native Americans of the Alabama area, the Cherokees, the Creeks, are forced by Andrew Jackson out west. And in this article, they are inviting them back from Oklahoma. And I
wonder if they came back.
Oh, I don't know. However, today, near where Horseshoe Bend is, it's where I went as a child. They take you and you have to hike around it. It's not a fun field trip, or I didn't find it a fun field trip.
I have been there.
It's a state park. I personally find Andrew Jackson a very problematic figure. Because Trail of Tears, it's a forced genocide. They're forcing people. Most did not survive it. However, in that area now, we do have the Porch Creek Casino. And the Porch Creek today they're a major cultural force here. They support a lot of the arts here, obviously through the casino. They're moving, I think, to introduce, we don't have a lottery in Alabama. I think they're trying to introduce it. Like Florida has the lottery, it goes to education. So they have become a major economic and political force here in Alabama today. So to see this, I don't know, they want to have this commemoration, we'll say, but to have a whole page dedicated. And they do have, for example, they have Sequoia, various Native Americans, various generals that were in that battle. And I wonder if this is what young Zelda is referring to.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it hadn't been in the papers.
Yeah, before. And
Right.
but it's interesting that she would mention that she didn't think they had been treated well, because this article does not give that indication. Hey, do you want to come celebrate with us? No, thank
So
you.
where did she pick that up from?
Well, that's my...
Getting back to that bohemian family she came from.
Yes, and I also wonder how much of it's interesting that Marie Bankhead Owen didn't censor it. Because that's something she didn't have to put that in her article. Yeah, so, she makes this very political statement in her article.
And I made a connection, Sarah Mayfield, as even a younger child, is interviewed in the same article. She also mentions the Native American and the troubles they have. And I'm wondering if Zelda, who was a great friend of Sarah Mayfield, whether she influenced her in those opinions. Probably, knowing what a strong-minded kid she was.
Yeah. And again, I think Zelda, and you look at the time period, I know, because I went to University of Florida, I have family that went to Florida State, the question of the Native American mascot. And Florida State, Chief Osceola is the mascot of the Florida State Seminoles. And the Seminole Nation in Florida created that mascot. And so that's one of the few, there's a controversy over the mascot, but that's one of the few in which that the Seminole Nation created it, and it's a co-celebration. And you just think, it's the hard thing. You admire someone, and then we think today of negative stereotypes, and what is that dividing line? But when you have children this age, I think there is a very genuine
sympathy.
Well, sympathy, but you think where Zelda says she likes it because they are strong swimmers, I think, and they're fearless. And you think about the attributes that she is given, particularly in high school. She is such a strong swimmer. She's a lifelong swimmer. All the boys talk about how brave she is, that she's fearless. She's going off the high dive. You can see that I really think she took to heart their example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an interesting and unusual connection,
Yeah.
I think.
So the next one is, we're going to do two, because I think, again, shows a very interesting contrast within culture in Alabama in 1911. One is an article, and it's by Dr. Albert Franklin Owens, known as Dr. A.F. Owens. He was at Tuskegee Institute, had previously been at the Selma, I think, Normal School. If you don't know, Tuskegee Institute is a traditional black college founded by Booker T. Washington. And he did a weekly column. This newspaper is on a Sunday. He had a column goes, what the Negro is doing for himself in the South. And he goes and talks about the positive economic impact that African Americans were having, how much they are contributing to production, to labor, to livelihood. He also says, I'll read just briefly, in my last article, I called attention to the fact that since Tuskegee Normal Industrial Institute was founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881, 12,000 students were enrolled, and that number 1508 have graduated. I also stated that the earning capacity of these students has increased 600%. In other words, their average earnings before entering Tuskegee was only about 100. And he then goes and elucidates all the gains that their students are making, and then he also lists how many have gone on to teach at this kind of expanding network of what we now call traditional black colleges. So this is not relegated. This is page 6. This was again a weekly column that he did. And so in this paper you have the call for women's suffrage, that Native Americans are not being treated well. You're talking about the social impact that African Americans are having on the economy, positive impacts on the life and economy. And then kind of buried in the back next to an ad, there's this very small, very short little, this is just 2 small paragraphs, and it says, "Unknown Negro is lynched. 50 men avenge death of Mississippi farmer whom the black man murdered." And it goes on to talk about how this unnamed man is alleged to have shot a farmer, and that he tried to make an escape, that he was taken to the jail where his captors were overtaken by a mob who then forced them to give up the prisoner. And 2 things, it's just so To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes.
I mean, and it's shocking. And to see in the same newspaper where you have...
The same day.
On the same day, in the same paper, you have an esteemed man, and by esteemed, you can look it up. The then the governor, Emmett Owen, was highly complimentary of Dr. Owens. No, it's Emmett. I've gone totally blank. Emmett O'Neill was the governor. And we know that you can look it up in the Encyclopedia of the State of the Who's Who. In the article for Dr. Owens, the governor of Alabama, who was white, obviously, was very complimentary in those strides that Dr. Owens is making for the betterment of all Alabamians of both races. And he even mentions in that article, and hopefully we can clip it, that most of the friction is based on what he said was ignorance and prejudice. And then you see this. But you should know also that in Montgomery, this unknown man, there is now a memorial here. The Equal Justice Memorial is now here in Montgomery. And so it just paints, and that memorial...
Across the street from Zelda's house.
From Zelda's childhood home. So the Cottage Hill neighborhood where Zelda grew up is now home to the National Lynching Memorial.
Yeah.
So I think it's good for...
Yeah, we encourage people to visit Montgomery, not only to see the Fitzgerald Museum, which is wonderful, but also to visit these civil rights memorials that we have throughout town.
And I do think that we are seeing in this time period that even though my question with the Fitzgeralds is also they didn't seem to be very political, but one wonders if they were self-censoring because their opinions, like you say, were more bohemian and went against at that time conventional belief.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah, I don't know that they were. You see very young Zelda being very, in her family, and again, Marie Bankhead Owen making very political statements for an 11-year-old, and then as time goes on,
we don't hear anything.
Yeah, we don't. You just don't hear anything. So the next one is on page 7. This one made me laugh because there is an ad for Jackson Square Coffee. And as an Alabamian, New Orleans figures prominently in your life. And most people know, of course, Cafe du Monde. I think today's a parallel would be you get coffee from Cafe du Monde. I have a tin. It's a big orange tin. It's chicory
and coffee.
Yes.
I just came back from New Orleans. Well, I was there in November, and I was spending all my mornings at Cafe du Monde.
Yeah.
With the beignets, the heavily sugared beignets, and the chicory coffee is absolutely delicious.
So, they were probably drinking. We'll get more to what we know, what brands were here when they were here, and a lot of them we still have today, but I was heartened to see Jackson Square Coffee. We're going to just list the next, like page 8 were the cotton reports. Cotton is still very much king in Alabama in 1911. You don't really have the infamous boll weevil until I think about 1918, 1919. The next is, I found interesting, this is again the Sunday paper, and there's an entire single page called My Airplane Adventures, and it's the story of someone in an early airplane. The other thing most people don't know about Montgomery history is that after Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers established their flight school here. And it's in large part why we still have the Air War College here at Maxwell Field in Montgomery. And it's also local lore that Tallulah Bankhead gave her first performance to the Wright brothers in her aunt Marie Bankhead Owen's parlor. Yeah, that's local lore. So the airplane figures very prominently in Montgomery society. We know it figures very prominently in Scott and Zelda's story later. You know,
It figures prominently if you're just living here, because
Yes.
sometimes the fighter jets go over your house.
oh, still, yes. What I was referring to is that how airmen would fly, or what was known as buzz, Zelda's house.
Yes.
Yes, if you don't know what buzzing is, it's where you fly your plane low over someone's house. And my grandfather was stationed here in World War II. He was a B-29 flight engineer, and he was in the air when VJ Day was declared. And he and his fellow crewmates went and buzzed their wives' homes.
Aw.
And his commander came over the radio and says, "Gentlemen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but if I get your tail numbers, you're grounded." So I should walk it back a little bit. So they didn't buzz my grandmother's house, but they buzzed his flight crew. So buzzing your wife, your girlfriend's house was something they were still doing well into World War II. The next is the girl at Duke story. So in the newspaper, I just found it very interesting. We don't have it today. You're having these short stories, adventure stories, romance stories, full page stories taking up a whole page in the newspaper.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we don't do that today. And then on page 11, we're going to throw this to Mara. She was very excited to see this.
Maybe too excited. Yeah, we have an advertisement for a new gas range, a stove basically. So we find that in 19, we're finally getting away from the wood stove, and we're going into a more modern, easier way to cook food. It was produced by the Montgomery Light and Water Power Company. Cooking can be made a pleasure instead of drudgery when you use a gas range. You know, it's very difficult maintaining a wood stove. So here we now have gas.
And it says every domestic science teacher will verify the statement.
Her services are at your command. Just call Isabel Laws at 2720. That's the telephone number.
I thought you made an interesting comment about the illustration for the ad.
Yes, you know, the as with all these ads from this period of time, they're very beautiful. I find very delicately drawn, and we see a woman who is obviously a salesperson for the gas range, and she's giving a demonstration to a housewife who's sitting very haughtily, I would say, on a chair with her arms closed, her arms crossed, a kind of show me expression on her face. And of course, women in those days did sell, they were saleswomen. They would travel all around the country selling things like stoves. So that is that.
So we have a few other innovations, and we're just going to kind of lump them together instead of going page by page. The next one was a motorcycle ad, and it says an important factor in the modern business world, and it goes on to champion the use of a motorbike, and it has an early Indian it's RACYCLE, I don't know it. The Racicle, maybe, and the Indian are two of the very best makes on the market. And so it's extolling, so it's kind of early waiter, because it's saying the makers, they are championing this early motorized bicycle for deliveries.
It's curious, we go back to Indians again and race it with speed.
Yes. So, but it's talking about how if you have a package that you need delivered from the shop or whatnot, that this can deliver it to your home with speed that horses can't. But you just think we now have Uber, the waiter system. So we have kind of proto-Uber in the early motorcycle. The other one, and I'm looking for what page, that really fascinated me is refrigerating systems will keep us cool. And it says, ideal homes of the future will be kept cool by electrically operated refrigerating plants. And it then goes on to basically describe early air conditioning. And it explains how that will work with coils. And well, at first is basically talking about an electric refrigerator. And then it goes on to say, talking about artificial ice will be made by condensing ammonia gas. And then they go on to say, not only will you have this refrigerated box for your food instead of ice, that you will also have your entire home with electrically powered or operated, what we now call air conditioning.
System, yeah.
So we've got early Uber, early gas ranges.
Yeah, and of course, as a new Montgomeryan who just experienced her first summer here, you start to understand how important cooling is in this society. One thing that you see in the letters of Scott Fitzgerald in particular, constant complaints about the heat, especially in Montgomery.
Yeah, how sweltering it is.
Yeah.
And it is.
And you really have to, it's made me wonder the heat, the effect of heat on writers, just how much it becomes a character in so many of the great novels and plays, from Tennessee Williams to Faulkner to the Fitzgerald short stories that are set in the South.
Yeah.
Thank God for air conditioning.
It's also, most people don't realize why so much Southern architecture, one, is built up off the ground, but also why you have such high ceilings, because that heat rises. And
they were very intelligent.
Yeah.
The building down here is, it's obviously designed to keep you cool, even in winter when you're freezing, because the ceiling is so high.
There's this, it's slightly different, but in Japan there was a monk that says anyone can be warm in winter, but who can be cool in summer? And you're like, sir, you did not know the joys of air conditioning. So we're going to jump now to the Busy Bees Cafe. There's a page that has 4 ads that, you get these clusters of ads. And the first is from the Busy Bees Cafe. Which cafe there was a story that you thought the Busy Bees Cafe might be about?
Yeah, well, in Save Me the Waltz, in the beginning, Alabama Beggs, who's the Zelda character, goes with her sister Dixie, who's Rosalind Sayre, to a cafe. And it's obviously based on either the Busy Bee or I think maybe the Pickwick Cafe.
Yeah, and I thought it might also Montgomery Fair. Montgomery Fair also had a very popular cafe.
Yeah. There were a lot in downtown Montgomery, but I love the name of the Busy Bee.
And read this menu. I mean, this is an impressive menu.
Yeah, it is.
For a lunch.
Well, there's a lot of French here, so there's going to be a lot of mispronunciation.
We'll give it our southern go.
Oyster cocktail mignonette, tasso supreme, bisque of tomato a la cardinal, fish, Mexican.
Don't know.
Baked bass a la Mexican.
Yeah.
Palm Saratoga, chicken croquettes, which of course is still popular today. Country pig barbecue. Now we're getting down to it.
You missed the French string beans. That's very southern.
Is it? Yeah.
Yes. I mean, French string beans with a roast and a barbecued pig with candied potatoes. Wow.
I wonder if that's candied sweet potatoes.
Probably.
Russian salad. We have no idea what Russian salad is. I'm going to have to investigate that.
Yeah.
And dessert, we have creme fouette.
Yeah, I guess.
I guess so, whatever creme fouette is.
And then you have coffee, chocolate, and tea. So that's clearly a chocolate drink. Is that maybe a chocolate milk? I don't know. We're going to have to.
No, maybe a mousse of some sort, a chocolate mousse. I do know that I wish I had the description from Save Me the Waltz of what the child Alabama Biggs orders. It's hilarious. I mean, it's a huge amount of food.
We'll contrast it. The other two ads, which I think are hilarious because they are next to each other. One is it's the U.S. Navy, and it's for a whiskey. Red Top Rye, America's finest whiskey.
41 years.
Yeah, 4 full quarts is $5. So that, we were looking at something earlier that $3 was roughly adjusted 80 today. So $5 is, it's not, full 4 quarts is not inexpensive. But then next to it, there's this ad, and it's Since John Quit Drinking by John's wife.
Yeah, look at that. Right next to the whiskey.
Yeah, right next to the whiskey. Costs nothing to try. And so you send this coupon, you mail it in to Dr. J.W. Haynes Company, and he will send you this odorless, tasteless something. It's some kind of remedy. It says, use Golden Remedy, the greatest home treatment for drunkards.
Probably loaded with booze as well. It's very funny, and it's a father grabbing his wife and little girl in a hug. All is forgiven kind of a pose.
They're having this family group hug. Very odd. And then the last one is when a baggie rattles, and we have the Montgomery Carriage Works. So we're in this interesting moment. We still have horse and carriages. Montgomery was one of the first cities in the U.S. to have electric streetcars. It was known as the Lightning Route. We now are the flight school, so we've got airplanes flying over. And I just think Alabama is at this, it's the cutting edge of innovation.
Yeah.
We're now getting gas stoves, electric,
It's a happening town.
So I hopefully this will give a more full picture of Zelda and her family life. The last one we want to cover is that there's 2 more. There's also an ad for the Tennille Furniture Company. They're selling Mission-style porch swings, rockers. The Mission rocker was $2.98. We looked that up. It's about $80 adjusted. And I think this would be very similar, like if you go to a Cracker Barrel today, you can buy those rockers. Yeah, and those are about $100. Those are more traditional. This is a very more modern, like you said, craftsman
it's kind
style.
Of stickly.
And we were both saying
design.
to have those today. To have that rocker today, because those were very sturdy. It would be worth a fortune today.
Try finding these at auction and estate sales down here. It's impossible to find them.
Also important is that the Tennille Furniture Company, and again, this is probably, it's a coincidental parallel, but the Tennille and Burton family owned the 919 Felder House at this time. The owners, they lived here. Their warehouse, they have a fire in August of 1911. And they then sell this house to Viola and Nick Jones. And Viola passes, but Nick Jones is the owner of the Felder home, who then rents it to Scott and Zelda in the 1930s. But it's just interesting that you see the ad, you see the family that own the house, that she, that we're recording, that we were recording from. They're in the same paper as well. We have 2 more. The next is General Simon Bolivar Buckner Hale on his 88th birthday. He was a Confederate general. In his obituary, which is I think 2 or 3 years later, it had this very interesting story. It says, during the war between the states, General Buckner transferred valuable property to his brother-in-law to prevent confiscation. When his relative died, General Grant of the Union side aided his old enemy in recovering his lost property. Later, when financial reverses attended Grant, Buckner went to his aid. So it's interesting. I think we live in such kind of polarized times that we realize that even though you did have the Civil War, that
There was a sense
after,
of forgiveness.
after, particularly you look at Lincoln towards Jefferson Davis.
Grant and Lee
Yeah.
meeting in the White House after the war. Lee trying to get, monies restored to the Southland.
Yeah. We don't know if it's just a mere coincidence or if there is some kind of connection, is that Zelda's mother, her maiden name was Minnie Buckner Machen. And we did ask Sam Lanahan, and he was not sure of the connection either, because when she marries, she becomes Minnie Machen Sayre. And we don't know, but General, and it's a great name, Simon Bolivar Buckner Hale, he was from Kentucky, dies in the Louisville area, and that's where Zelda's mother is from. So we don't know if there's some distant family connection.
Fellow too.
Yeah, he's very distinguished. His young photo at the bottom kind of looks like, to me, I've gone blank, in No Country for Old Men, Josh Brolin. He looks like Josh Brolin, young.
I see it.
Yeah.
I see it.
And the last one I wanted to end on, the back page of this newspaper for the 26th of March, 1911, is a full-page ad for Montgomery Fair. Montgomery Fair was the prominent department store, and most people may know it in history today as where Rosa Parks worked. It was on the corner where the Klein and Son jewelers were, and that's where the Rosa Parks bus stop and now statue to Rosa Parks is. So we have all the early beginnings of not only Fitzgerald history with Zelda, but after Scott's death, when Zelda moves back here, we know that Hank Williams moves to Montgomery in, 36? Mm-hmm. We know that Zelda, Hank Williams, and Rosa Parks are all in Montgomery, possibly as early as 38, but definitely by 1940. Rosa Parks is working at Montgomery Fair as a seamstress. Zelda, we know, is spending a lot of time on Dexter Avenue, possibly taking dance lessons above where Chris's Hot Dogs is today.
We know she lost Scotty, this would have been in 31. We know she lost Scotty in a department store. She does not name the department store, but what other store could it have been?
There were probably 2 or 3. You had Nachman Motif, you had Montgomery Fair, and you also had, I think, Capitol. I'm not sure, because that was the Hart family owned it. But this is most likely Montgomery Fair was the prominent one.
I choose to believe it
yes,
was
Montgomery Fair. But also, Hank Williams is spending an enormous amount of time at Chris's Hot Dogs, which is a restaurant still there today. So we know that Zelda, Hank, and Rosa Parks are all on Dexter Avenue in a very close proximity at that time. And we see, we don't have Hank Williams in this paper, but we have all the antecedents of Zelda's life. We have the antecedents of the coming civil rights. We have, all of these things.
Musical history being made.
So it's amazing that it's kind of all there in 1911. And so we hope you enjoyed this. If you have any area as we move forward, again, we're going to be starting with her childhood, moving into her early adolescence, then her high school, leading up to who was she the moment she meets Scott Fitzgerald. And then we will go into their time together here in Montgomery while he's stationed here as a young lieutenant. So if you have any questions, please email us. It's zeldaspeachesandbiscuits@gmail.com. We will have Instagram, hopefully you've seen it, hopefully a Facebook group page. So follow us, like us. We also will have starting our intro music, and we'll be having hopefully different pieces of music from the time period as well, and you'll be able to hear those full songs on YouTube. So again, email us if you have any questions, requests, any mysteries you want us to hopefully unravel, and we hope to see you here again.